It may be hard to believe that electric vehicles are nothing new. In fact, some of the earliest cars were electric powered. And back then, they had some of the same issues that we're bringing up today regarding infrastructure, range, and power. And while internal combustion engines won the race, recently, with better technology and concerns over climate change, many manufacturers are turning it back to electric vehicles.
This is going to be a little bit maybe controversial, especially for our audience, talking about EVs, electric vehicles. We're probably maybe not going to get too far into maybe some of the politics or the soapbox, kind of stuff, especially that a lot of the, car guys do. But we're just looking to kind of trace the history of this, kind of some of the key milestones and maybe why we're seeing a lot of push for it right now, but also we got to remember that these were around 100 years ago.
Right.
Electric vehicles didn't just pop up, with the Prius or the Tesla or something like that. And we'll get into some of the custom ones and the swaps and kind of what it takes to do that. But let's go back in time.
Yes.
So it's, the first car was 1898, right? With the Benz, it was a Benz.
Right. Now you're talking about combustion engine.
Combustion engine. Yeah, obviously there's steam power, coal power, all that kind of stuff. But what we think of as the very first car was late 1800s.
Exactly. Mercedes credits themselves at 1889 being the first model year that they produced a combustion engine that you could purchase.
Yeah.
Okay, so not just the first one, but they were in
not
business.
the first one that his wife drove, to the town over. Yeah.
Right. This was for purchase. So you're looking at that year. But what's really funny is even back to Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, flew his kite with a key, right? He had a lot of sketches and a lot of drawings on electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And at the time, farming, of course, was the major industry.
Yeah.
And they were looking for other ways to replace mules. So by the 1820s, 1830s...
You mean we could have had electric mules?
I know, huh?
That's kind of motorcycle. But,
yeah. But that's what was funny is that they were making what they called carts, electric carts, to haul different, farm equipment or even their fruits or whatever they grew.
Yeah, and just real quick on that, we talk about EVs, electric vehicles, basically your cars and your trucks, and those have kind of had gone away from their original kind of versions, and then now kind of started to come back more, but the utility aspect of an EV has been around kind of continuous, where a lot of places, like your milk delivery in the morning 40, 50 years ago, in some places was an electric vehicle because it's kind of a good thing for some of that, or like the people movers, at Disneyland, or the tram thing at the airport, that's taking you to your gate, or running around. Obviously, if you're indoors, you can't have a combustion engine. So there's been a lot of, utility EVs.
We have a manufacturer here in Anaheim, California called Taylor Dunn that has been making electric vehicles, people movers, equipment movers, whatever you want to call it, movers, for large manufacturing facilities for the last 70 years.
Yeah.
Frank Curry worked at Taylor Dunn of Curry Enterprises.
Well, and that's kind of how we got to start, because then the forklifts and all that, they needed rear ends.
Exactly.
And anyways, that's another episode.
Because we're actually talking, excuse me, everybody. I have some notes here that I've looked up some stuff because I actually was impressed by the amount of information that's really available that was about kind of the similar things that are happening today.
Well, and that's, the interesting thing is a lot of stuff that we're talking about with, maybe a lack of infrastructure for charging or costs of batteries and maybe some efficiency questions compared to, what we've traditionally had, with internal combustion engines and fuel. That kind of, like you're saying, was the exact same thing with electric vehicles, with gas, with steam, with whatever energy, was being used 120 years ago.
We're heavily into the Industrial Revolution at this time.
Yeah.
And really the person that's the first American, because let's get that straight too, because electric cars didn't come from America. Sorry. But the first American that is credited with building the electric car was a guy named William Morrison. In 1890 is when he came out with his first car. So that's
that's the same time frame as what we consider the first car.
exactly, you know, and we're talking first combustion car.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't teach us that in school. They taught us, the combustion engine in school, but they didn't teach us anything about this electric stuff in school. So it's very interesting also too, because, I was brought up that there was over 2,000 ICE engine manufacturers during that time period. Well, there was 1,800 electric car builders during that time period.
It's the same thing. Everybody was, it's think of it as a tech boom.
Exactly.
Obviously we talk about the Industrial Revolution. We talk about, now with digital and tech boom and all that stuff. It's same kind of thing. A lot of startups, a lot of smaller, entrepreneurs that are going to be, trying to make it happen. And it's going to be a race of who's going to win. Things might be standardized, whether it is the electric vehicle or it is, gas, oil powered.
Right.
You're going to have to kind of pick one and run with it essentially.
Well, and the other thing too is I think why it was so popular at the time is because people were carriage builders for horse and buggies. Yeah. Right. So people are already making elaborate coaches and carriages. So these guys were like, wow, what if you got rid of the horse? So most of those guys, they were craftsmen with woods and different items. They weren't a guy that was going to machine an engine and make something work with, a combustible surface or a combustible fuel. So these guys, they was like, look, I can build this nice carriage, and if this battery thing drives it, hey, I'm good.
Yeah, maybe for them it was less about what was powering it, just the fact that it was powered.
Well, and they made them
that alone is a huge leap from being drawn by horse and carriage to horseless carriage.
Horseless carriage, so. Which was okay, and this was a huge status symbol at that time too. If you had an electric car, basically you had anything that didn't require a horse, right? Then you were a baller. So to have this electric thing and remember too, back then electric cars, they didn't smell like gasoline. They didn't rumble like a Model T. Mm-hmm. They didn't. You didn't have to hand crank them in the snow. Like there were a lot of kind of pluses of saying like, hey, I want this electric thing. You know.
Well, and that's around the time, or maybe a little bit before that had happened, was kind of the electrification of a lot of the country and a lot of the world as well.
Right.
Obviously going from heating oil, for street lamps to, an electric grid.
Yes.
To turn lights on into, power, stuff like that.
Well, so, you're talking Edison Tesla times, and I mean Nikola Tesla, not the car.
Elon.
Right. Yeah. But I mean that's you look at that race that those guys had. I mean, and they
whole
literally
AC/DC
had. I was going to say, right.
I mean, it's kind of interesting too. Some of this, you dive into the story of that and that whole, battle, and it wasn't necessarily for a car. It was, homes and, businesses and
street
all
lamps.
That stuff. But
Electric Avenue, like that kind of stuff. Yeah.
They were slinging some mud back and forth with the electric chair.
Exactly.
It wasn't just that electric chair would kill somebody.
Sure.
It was this type of electricity was used to kill him. To do that. So there was a lot of battling back and forth, because especially too, the big money in America, especially back then, was oil money.
Oil money, exactly.
From like I said, the heating oils, all that stuff, not necessarily the gasoline.
Rockefeller Center is called Rockefeller Center for a reason.
Yeah,
I mean, John D. Rockefeller had a huge monopoly on heating oil, and of course. That was one thing for him. Like, I've got leftover fuels here that I can find other uses for. I'm going to explore those fuels. So, but we'll get into that. Let's stick on, because there are a few things. I mean, some of the notable things about the first cars were that obviously it's kind of like what everybody kind of says the same thing now 100 years later, that they were slow and had a poor range, right? Yeah. Most of these things went about 15 to 20 miles an hour. And
I mean, what's interesting too is that think of the internal combustion cars at that time.
Right.
Fairly similar too. I mean,
sure.
They weren't going that fast, and probably didn't have a huge range. Maybe it was better than the electric vehicles.
Exactly.
But and battery technology back then was very rudimentary and just kind of
and if your farm didn't have electric lights anyways. It was really difficult to plug into something when you don't even have lights in your home, right? So, think of like the Amish, all of a sudden saying, hey, I want an electric buggy. This is kind of very similar back 100 years ago. So, but it makes me wonder though, what beat them out? Because at the time, if we're like electrifying the country, don't you think that we would like have this grid? If electric cars were the thing that we were going to do, I mean, don't you think we'd be a little further along?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. If you're kind of running with one, energy source for most of what you're doing, but you're not doing that for your cars. No. So it is interesting seeing how all that kind of played out, and then it's kind of coming full circle.
Well, and the other thing too is, and this is kind of the start of the end of the turn of the century cars, was price. Your average electric car was somewhere up north of like $1,700, where a Model T in 1912 was $650.
And that's a lot of it too. We're talking about the early 1900s, and 1904 was the first Model T.
Right.
But obviously, 10 years later, by then Model T, it was huge numbers.
Yeah.
So your average citizen that, could afford a couple $100 to get a car.
Right.
Well, Henry Ford wasn't doing electric vehicles.
Nope.
So that's not what you were getting for that price. So obviously, more people have gas.
Yeah. And well, also too, if you have somebody like, John Rockefeller that's producing this thing called gasoline, that's a byproduct of kerosene that's being used to heat your home, and he's got this leftover stuff that he'll sell you for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
Then you're never going to win.
And I mean, we'd have to probably look some numbers up, but I'm sure electricity was probably...
It was a premium.
Yes. It wasn't available everywhere.
Right.
And I mean, now we kind of, like a gas station, on the corner, back then, maybe it was just a hand pump and you do it. Maybe there wasn't electricity even at the gas station.
You just said another thing. You just said infrastructure. You just said gas station, because you can transport gasoline. It's very difficult to transport electricity.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You can transport, you could have a gasoline truck, let's say, drive somewhere.
Right.
And fill something up.
A tank, right.
Whereas, unless you're using a generator, which then might either require battery or gasoline, you have to build all the electrical connections at a location to have that. So
right.
For the early years, I mean, now it's kind of like, of course you're going to have even a gas station that's with electricity, because that's how everything
has electricity.
But back then,
yes,
you might not have had that necessarily, but you could, even throw, a barrel of gasoline or whatever in the back of your horse-drawn carriage to take it somewhere.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was really the big killer, because, I mean, honestly, this is what's really funny about it. Electric cars did well until around the 30s. I mean, and there's a few standouts that, I hear on my notes, I've got a few standout companies. I mean, Baker Electric, they were a huge one. Studebaker actually started out as an electric company before they started making combustion engines. So Studebaker, I mean, they were a stranglehold on this company, or on this industry. But the biggest one was probably Detroit Electric.
Yeah.
Which Detroit Electric also shared ties with General Motors. So there was Detroit Diesel, which I know a lot of people still know about Detroit Diesel, which is still alive to this day. Yeah. But Detroit Electric made the masses.
So how come GM wasn't Detroit Gas?
Right? Well, because
they've got Detroit Electric, Detroit Diesel.
Yeah, why they made Detroit Gasoline? Well, because they had Chevrolet.
Yeah.
And that was also a marketing thing, because obviously Gaston Chevrolet was a famous race car driver at the time, and you needed a standout to represent a car. So hence, Gaston Chevrolet's name is what bears, General Motors' best-selling car.
He's got Gaston in the first name, so he's got gas. He's got gas in there.
Right. But those were the guys. Like I said, I think Detroit Electric was the last of the electrics that they sold their last car in like 1929. Okay.
Also, too, at that point, there had been a huge discovery of oil in the United States.
That as well. We have Texaco.
Texas, yeah. So that that kind of pushes, when there's obviously a lot more supply for something.
Well,
and that's they were trying, with the electric vehicles. And that's what's funny. And we'll probably go back to this a couple more times, saying it of the same issues or thoughts now exist.
Same then, yeah.
Back then, where you had some charging areas, but there was exchange stations.
Exactly.
So I mean, obviously these only had a handful of batteries, not anywhere near what we have now. But
Right.
yeah, you could go and exchange your dead battery for a freshly charged one and be on your way.
It's like a propane tank for your barbecue.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, they were trying to make it work, and it just, one took the lead.
The cheap price of fuel is what really killed the electric car, because people kept putting more effort into the into the combustion engine cars.
Mm-hmm.
So 1912, Charles Ketterling, I'm saying that right, I hope, he invented the electric starter. Game changer.
Yeah,
Because
no more hand cranking.
No more hand cranking your car to get it started.
Mm-hmm.
No more it's snowing outside and I don't want to drive my car because I got to crank it. No, you just go step on the button and then, car starts.
Yeah.
So that was a game changer. And then also, again, like I mentioned, you can buy a Model T for under $1,000 and those other cars were like $2,000. So, and you could drive over the river and through the woods to grandma's house without stopping and doing a battery exchange.
Yeah.
So again, there you go with what's happening right now. Like
it's just, the technology, we think of technology now as computers and stuff like that, but technology has all forms.
All forms.
And that's kind of what it just kind of kept growing a little bit more and a little bit quicker.
So that was like the start of the dark years, though. I'll say dim years, because from the 30s until about like the 50s, 60s, electric cars not even spoken about.
No, they just didn't even exist, or there's anything really. Like I said, there was probably your carts or your little utility kind of things.
Taylor done.
That's mostly it, but that's not
on
street legal driving somewhere.
And they didn't look at it as a consumer level. They looked at it more as like a supplier of manufacturers. Like we mentioned, the Taylor Duns or the different utility carts or, train operated stuff, forklifts, those kind of things. They all stayed, electric or had some type of electric counterpart. So, and that worked out well for a while. But really what got people talking about electric cars again was the 1973-74 oil embargo, where OPEC basically told us to screw ourselves and we were out of gas.
Mm-hmm. And there was some stuff a little bit earlier than that. I mean, obviously that's when it really kind of started being talked about more, but you go back into a little bit before that, the Department of Energy started, giving grants and sponsoring projects.
There's actually,
to have things being built. And it's kind of interesting too. And I think this was in the 60s. I didn't put the year down, but the first electric car to go 60 miles per hour.
Oh.
And had a range of 60 miles. The Henny Kilowatt.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That was that little, looks like almost like
very
a Citron.
small little Citron looking thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay. Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people were messing around with it, but it just, really ramped up in the 70s and
it did.
And then on.
Because there was a guy named, they called it a Fritchie. And this was turn of the century. I think he made them from like 1908 to maybe 15 or something like that. But there was a model called a Fritchie that was actually, he was a professor that taught at a school, I want to say a Midwest school, like Indiana. And he developed a car that had the insane range of 100 miles, which was like a record breaker for many, many years.
Yeah.
Right?
Especially, that.
At the time, you were talking 20 miles was like the average range, right? And his car, he would brag about it, his car could go 30 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Which 30 miles an hour, you got to remember that my great uncle was on the front page of newspapers for going 60 miles an hour, right? For going a mile a minute.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal.
This is before there was any stop signs or stop lights or speed limits, I'm sure, too. Yeah.
But that technology kind of hung around until like that 60s, 70s. Like, again, like nobody was thinking of like, this is a viable thing.
Yeah.
We get to the oil embargo. And the great thing about the oil embargo is everything now is kind of on the table, because now Congress is looking into this and saying, hey, look, in 76, they passed the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Research Development and Demonstration Act. Say that 5 times fast.
Is there an acronym for that?
You know what? I didn't look that up.
EV...
EHVRDD. Okay.
Irvid.
Right?
Right.
But the greatest thing about this is that it didn't limit it to just electric vehicles. This is when we started looking into hydrogen. We looked into
all alternative fuels.
And this act right here still is funding a lot of research that's still happening to this day. So when we look at, different administrations that have been, for the last 50 years, look, even our administration 50 years ago was looking into this.
Yeah. Well, and that's when, like I mentioned, the Department of Energy started, and that was under Nixon.
Right.
And, one of the projects that they were involved with, we know a company called Garrett as Garrett Turbo.
Yes.
But they, helped kind of start the regen braking, the flywheel,
Right.
Braking. And that was based off of a grant or a contract from the Energy Department.
Right. And that technology today, Porsche has actually really been the forerunners on those.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they've got it dialed now. And that came from racing though.
Yeah.
They did that for Le Mans.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at, when people say, oh, those guys put a bunch of money into racing cars for what? Well, all of that regen stuff is based from the Garrett design that then Porsche kind of really catered to today's use.
Yeah. And that's a lot of things, we talk about with the automotive world that kind of comes from racing and then trickles down into the, general consumer cars. The 60s, like I said, we're looking at, GM had an electric car concept.
Right.
They started coming out with, obviously it got a lot of attention with the lunar rover.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not driving a gas powered car without any oxygen. So when you're on the moon,
yes. So they had a small little, lunar LRV.
LRV, right. The lunar rover.
And that was in
vehicle.
71.
Yes. 71, 72. Obviously there's, I think 4 of them still on the moon. They didn't bring them home.
I mean, they might have gotten, Grand Theft Auto by some aliens or something like that.
The Russians showed up and the Russians left theirs. So there's 5 cars on the moon. 4 from the United States.
How many are on Mars? 3?
3.
2?
3.
Okay.
So we've got, but there is a Russian car on the moon. I don't know if he's a thug, but
Maybe they race each other on weekends, up
Right,
there. I mean,
right.
who knows what's happening?
Exactly.
But what's interesting, as well is, even before we're talking about the oil embargo and all that, in 72 with the Munich Olympics, BMW, had a concept EV that they called the Olympia.
Really?
That they displayed at the Olympics, is just
something to
look
brag
at,
about?
some technology,
Okay.
stuff like that. Obviously, their electric vehicle stuff came a lot later, but
Well, what I love is too,
people were messing around with
Yeah,
it in the
yeah.
70s, but a lot of it was still very concept.
well, what I love too is that GM took a shot out of it too, because like, as you mentioned to me today, which I had no idea, that they made an electric Corvair.
Yeah.
Wow. Tell me.
No, so they made electric Corvair, and it's called the Electrovair 2 concept.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I think they used it is because, with the engine in the back, pull that out, drop the motor in,
Easy drivetrain.
rear-wheel drive,
Yes.
you're good to go.
Right.
But that one used some leftover silver zinc batteries.
Okay.
And I know we're going to get a lot of technical into some of the different types of batteries and why that's made a huge difference
Right.
and why we have now. But and so these would only last for 100 charges.
And they were done.
And they had to be replaced.
Right.
So, that's the thing. Since the 60s, the 70s, every car company has experimented
Right.
and tested these. It's just the technology, it's progressed, but it's just still has to progress.
And also too, I know that everyone right now is thinking that I'm crazy, but gasoline is still cheaper to use. Now think of that. I know I'm saying that at $5, the average over here is 5 something.
560, yeah.
But if you look at it pound for pound, well, we're getting close though. And I don't want to get into a lot of that too, because I know that there'll be the guy like, well, I only drive it this many days, blah, blah, blah. But gasoline still has a stranglehold on us. And I think we're working in inroads on getting to a solution, but that's for a later time.
Yeah.
What I really want to bring up, the other one that GM did in the 70s was they made an Electrovet.
Not a Corvette.
Damn. I was going to get you. They made a Chevette.
A Chevette.
So they took
not the cool vet.
They took a Chevy Chevette and they put an electric motor in it, battery powered, and it didn't do it very well. They only built a concept just like the Corvair. But what it did though is, and what I'm kind of leading up to is that General Motors really didn't ever stop. In the 70s was because they were, GM was trying everything. So did you know they made an Electrovet?
Yeah, but not the cool Vet.
Oh, come on.
Not a Corvette. Yeah, not electric Corvette.
You told me it was a Hemi. Yeah, so they actually made a Chevette or a Chevette.
Yeah.
And
Looks nothing like a Vet.
No, looks like a small little tonneau car. But they put an electric motor in that, and they use it as a concept car. So GM, though, I don't think GM ever really gave up.
No, and that's, we'll get into kind of what's considered the first electric vehicle, production wise, or maybe even not production wise.
Well, it is, yeah.
But in 1988, there's a race that's done in Australia, and basically going across the entire
Outback,
desert.
yeah.
And let me start that over.
Okay. It's 88 or 86.
The one that I have is when they took first place is 88.
They started doing it in 86.
The race?
Yep.
Okay.
They pushed the car that was like the first concept, but you're right, they didn't win until 88.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and yeah, you're talking about GM, and obviously later they kind of developed what's a lot of people consider the first modern electric car.
Right.
But in the late 80s, there was a race in Australia, basically going through the whole Outback, and the GM Sun Racer won the event in 1988, and with a top speed of 42 miles an hour.
Right.
So this is a solar powered car, if you will.
Right.
It's basically fully solar powered, man steering.
Yes.
So has wheels, technically a car. What's interesting is that same year, what took second place, how much time longer do you think it took them for them to complete the race?
Yeah. Wow. Probably hours, if not maybe even.
So the second place, of that race was 2 days later.
Oh my God. Yes.
Yeah. So, the technology, obviously that's a very small scale, and
right.
that race and other similar, solar powered endeavors have kept going, even alongside, the traditional battery electric plugins.
Right.
But they were staying on top of the alternative, fuels.
And that paved the way for GM's EV-1.
Yeah.
Which the EV-1 is credited at being the first production car of the modern era, because it actually built 36 vehicles, which for the state of California to give you a production license or status,
you have to have a minimum.
You have to have a minimum of 30 cars.
Yeah.
So they built 36. 2 of them still exist.
What's interesting too is that EV-1, like style wise, it's kind of interesting because to me that does look like what an EV should look like.
Absolutely.
But I also think that the styling of that, and then obviously the Prius that came later,
right,
and some of those other EVs kind of pushed those into the tech nerd kind of market.
It was
as
marketed
opposed
that way.
to a car enthusiast or your general everyday driver.
I can recall the EV-1 coming out, and I remember the marketing because it was around the same time that they announced the brand Geo.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the EV-1 I thought was always a Geo.
And it looks kind of like a Geo Metro.
It does.
Kind of
and I understood GM's thought process behind that, because obviously they were trying to push a more of economy type of car,
Well, and back then especially, you didn't have the same amount of power or long range or all these things. So it was
like a metropolitan car.
Exactly. and make it so making it smaller is going to make it more efficient for the technology at the time. So that all makes sense. And what's interesting, I mean, you're talking about the size of it is tons of European concept cars and little things like that were basically just like a cart on with a windshield on it.
Right.
There was like the Scottish Scamp was a micro car.
Yeah.
So obviously we know what a micro car is, but it was EV powered, and there was several like that, but not really going to taking off.
Well, let's also now start talking about the next revolution, because obviously after EV-1, Toyota the very next year, in 1997, they applied for the same status in the state of California by building the RAV4.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people say the RAV4, that's gasoline powered. Well, the RAV4 was an electric vehicle before it was a gas powered vehicle.
And then, and that same year, they introduced the hybrid Prius.
Exactly.
That didn't obviously even come to the U.S. until a couple years later.
Right.
But
but so what's really funny, and here's what's kind of the dynamic of that, is that America wasn't ready for this. The 30 or I'm sorry, there was 46. I might be wrong on that, but there was around 40 of the original RAV4s that were produced in 1997. Okay, that means that it made the status of production vehicle, and they were available to the public. All of them were purchased by Southern California Edison, the power company. Now, the crazy thing is, and this is the thing that, everybody says EVs, they're not useful, they don't last a long time. Those vehicles lasted until 2012.
Oh,
they
wow.
were in service with the Southern California Edison for that long. So,
I mean, hey, they got, all the power.
well, they got, those are the guys, they didn't know where all the
plug it
juice is
in.
at, right?
Yeah, they know where the good stuff's at.
Right. So, that's something that when people, they think about, oh, those cars are disposable. Well, just like any other car, if you take care of it, it'll last, some of the time. But for the most part, like the EV-1's battery capacity was the death of that. And that's why there's, of course, I'm sure there was accidents or whatever, but the reason why most of them are off the streets is because, well, the batteries went bad. Mm-hmm. And the battery technology wasn't that good then because, again, we weren't using...
Well, and a lot of them were, lead acid batteries. So, which is fine for your, cranking up your car, your gasoline car. But to be the entire power source was very inefficient.
Well, and because you got to remember, too, electricity creates heat. Mm-hmm. So that's the other enemy of any type of battery is it's already creating its own heat. So if you're in the middle of Texas or the middle of Arizona, something like that, then of course your vehicles aren't going to run as well because the battery's obviously fighting against the heat. Same thing too. Electricity doesn't like to work in the cold. So if you're in areas like, our buddy Jeff Smith over there in Iowa.
Yeah, your range is either nothing or it's much lower.
Yeah.
And there was then obviously a little bit more push for some EVs, starting to pop up. Honda did the Insight in the late 90s.
Yeah. Which was a good looking little car.
Yeah.
That was kind of
that
cool
one was
car.
kind of good. But then, and, we talked about kind of the 70s being the first resurgence of electric vehicles being looked at as at least a concept because of smog regulations, emissions, all that. The 90s in California and then early 2000s across the country, there was even more, smog emissions regulations that took place. So all the companies then kind of started looking at, all right, let's start kind of further going with this EV deal, but kind of more so the hybrid. Well,
and thank God too. I mean, if we're keeping score at home, I'm a hybrid guy. Okay.
I would agree with you for that. I mean, it's especially with some of the modern hybrids and, what, even if you're looking at luxury cars of what they're doing with some of the hybrids of like, okay, so I can have even better fuel economy and more power and more, and I can plug it in if I want.
Right. Well, let's go back to 100 years ago. What were they useful for? They were useful for a small area that you didn't have to drive too much, and they didn't pollute anything, they didn't make noise, and they were clean. Yeah. Okay, so that to me sounds like an urban car. Mm-hmm. But if you're a guy that has to, or if you live out of California, you've got to drive some distance, right? So you're looking at maybe the next town over might be 30 or 40 miles. Well, 30 or 40 miles each direction, well, all of a sudden you're driving 100 miles. So that's where I think that the hybrid technology really kicks in to have that low speed, small footprint, around town driving to be on electric. Amazing.
Yeah. Well, that's what I remember. I don't know what the current one is now, which maybe we should because we're actually trying to be experts on this stuff. But I just remember at the time, saying like with the hybrid, maybe it was a Prius or something. All right, 30 miles, it's just going to, run on the battery.
Right.
And then obviously it can, the engine part will kick on to recharge the battery, and it all makes sense.
When was the last time you got into a taxi cab? They're all Priuses.
A lot of I mean, although the Uber I took the other day was a Dodge Power Wagon van.
Well,
so which was random and weird.
Yeah, that's
I didn't pick
Where were you
XL.
going?
I didn't pick the Uber XL.
But I mean, what I'm getting at is that the efficiency of those cars is amazing. And the other thing too to look at, and I'm glad that Toyota didn't abandon it, because there was a minute there where Toyota said, we're done with hybrid. And they recently retracted on that and said, well, you know,
Toyota's always had a very good relationship with the hybrid. 2007, they created a Toyota Supra hybrid, HVR, that won I'm probably saying this wrong, but the Takachi 24-hour endurance race in Japan.
Yes.
So you're now looking at hybrids winning races.
Hybrids make so much sense across the board because you're getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And I know that yes, I understand there are people out there that want a completely carbonless footprint, but then we can also get into the mining thing, and I don't really want to get into that.
I think we will get into that, but not too.
I'm just looking at like what it's going to change our lives, right? Because okay, guys, we can't suck up the dinosaurs like we're doing,
and that's the thing. It's both electricity and gas are resources,
exactly,
and also electricity doesn't just magically appear in thin air.
No,
so you have to use other resources that are finite,
right,
to do it. And if you're able to spread that load out,
right,
amongst multiple resources, you're going to be better than just completely going and gutting one resource.
Exactly.
I know we said we weren't going to get too far into it, but I've got the notes and it was pretty interesting.
Okay.
So lithium mining.
Okay.
So lithium counts for about 6% of what, like for a battery on.
That's it?
Yeah. Cobalt makes up a lot more of it, nickel, all the other metals.
Right.
But the
cobalt, which is like extremely hard to extract.
Yes.
Okay, keep going. Yeah.
No. Yeah. And a lot of times there is a lot of child, labor involved in some, issues with that. But with lithium mining, it's considered worse than more emissions or more CO2 than I'm fucking this up because I didn't write out the full thing, and that's what's screwing. Because I just said battery production is worse than engine production. So let me say. So I mean, and that's with lithium mining. Obviously there's some environmental, issues there or things to talk about, but the production of batteries actually is more emissions than the production of an engine.
Exactly.
That's even before we get into, I mean, obviously I think we can kind of say that gets made up on the back end, with pollution coming out of a tailpipe versus the battery. But at least, if we're starting at ground zero, starting at the basics of what it takes to build an EV versus an internal combustion engine, vehicle, there are some issues, on one. So to create a EV vehicle, it's about puts out 17 metric tons of CO2 emissions.
Okay.
An engine vehicle, internal combustion engine for the production of that car is about 7 metric tons.
Wow.
So it's less.
Yeah.
But, you look at the oil, gasoline,
that's
so
still a dirty business.
oil refineries.
Yeah.
Oil refineries put out 280 billion tons of CO2 every year.
Sure.
And you get about 2 tons of CO2 for power plants.
Okay.
For each EV.
Right.
So there's a
now and again too. I don't want to be a debate.
No,
but that's currently how many power stations we have. Because what do we need more of? Power stations.
We need more power.
Right.
No, and that's the thing we're talking about. That all the infrastructure is. The power has to come from somewhere.
It does.
It's either coming from the ground and turn oil and turn into gasoline and turn into fire.
Right.
Or it's coming from a power plant for electricity the batteries material has to come from somewhere.
Right.
It's all that, you know, and then obviously then we're talking about, okay, how many gas stations are there versus charging stations?
Right.
But, you know, we're looking at the mid 2000s, and that's kind of really when production of EVs really start to ramp up and
Right.
become more common.
Well, I think also
this is only 15, 20 years
No,
ago
exactly.
that we're talking about. That's how...
But put this in perspective. When EVs started to get popular, what else got popular? Cell phones.
Cell phones,
Right?
Technology. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we went
Big
from
your
Yeah.
screens, your touch.
you went from a flip phone to an iPhone. You all of a sudden had all of the power of the universe in your pocket, right? And I think that if that didn't happen, guys like Elon Musk would have had a very difficult time to get something like this off the ground.
Well, and that's, I think a lot of it too is, you know, back to talking about the batteries, but lithium ion batteries, which is in what is currently used in almost everything now.
Right? Your power tools, everything. I mean,
Yeah,
I just
your
bought
cell phone, obviously, that we talked
Yeah.
about, your
Right.
car, you know,
Yeah.
stuff like that is that technology really did ramp up because of, you know, portable items like
Yeah.
your cell phone or like a you know, a handset, something like that, where
Yeah.
that battery technology just kept getting better.
Absolutely.
So that it was usable
Yes.
in a vehicle again.
Right.
You know, and the, you know, late 2000s, like 2008, you know, we're talking the Tesla Roadster.
Yes.
You know, which
Right.
essentially kind of a concept, but that, and I think because of the technology, because of you know, Elon Musk and that company being more a tech company than a
Right.
car company.
Yeah.
You know,
Thank you for that.
they were able to kind of ramp up things because that Tesla Roadster, the range of that Roadster was double
Yes.
previous electric vehicles.
All the stuff, right.
And that's if it's always, how long does it take to charge? How far can I go?
Right.
Two most either complaints or questions about electric vehicles. So when you start having companies that are doubling the
range and
of
speed.
something,
Yeah.
which also does mean the power
Right.
of it and, you know, all that, it really kind of changes it. And, you know, we talk about the EV-1 or the Honda Insight, some of that, they looked
Looked little,
like
they looked frail.
your
They looked,
EV. Like you go, oh yeah, that is an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
Tesla had style. They had luxury. They had that big screen before anybody. And so that made it appealing to kind of your, obviously it was much more expensive at the time, but it made it appealing to your Mercedes owners, your BMW owners.
So what you're telling me is they made them luxurious, opulent, and were for rich people to look at, just like what happened 100 years ago, right? So I mean, and that's why it's so funny to see this whole thing unravel, because it's exactly it.
But it's kind of what made electric cars cool,
Right.
And desirable.
But see, look, I'm a diehard
internal combustion engine.
I'm a diehard convertible.
We don't need to say ICE
I know, right?
because it's kind of weird. Let's just
So look, I like to hear
engine.
I like to
motor.
hear. I like to hear an engine. I don't
Yeah.
like to hear a motor. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to the both of them being together, but at the same time, too, I look at Elon as a device maker because he comes from a technology world.
Yeah.
And what I very much appreciate about the man is that he came out publicly and said, "Guys, I am not a car builder. I'm building transportation." Because if you look at some of his designs, I mean, very smart in the beginning to go with the Lotus Roadster, extremely already a proven car.
Small footprint, so you can make it as efficient as you can. Yes.
Speedy because it would be small and lightweight. So that was a great way for him to get his company started. You start looking into his other models that he came out with. Obviously, the Model S, the Model X, and the Model 3, right? Because he couldn't spell sex.
Well, no, they do spell sexy. Yeah,
That's true, but it's
You-
because
the S
Ford.
and then the 3,
Yeah, well, you know, the story behind that is that
and
Ford.
then the X and the Y. Yeah,
Right, but Ford registered E as a car, and it's made
Maybe
Elon crazy. That's why it's the 3.
Econoline, van or something. Maybe.
Well, whatever it was, they were smart enough to see the foresight to say, I'm going to, they're going to register that. So that's the reason why your Model 3s are not an E.
It's like the iPhone. You can tag an I onto anything,
right.
And tag an E onto it.
But Elon's like, if you look at some of his cars, I mean, like the Cybertruck to me looks like something that a kindergarten drew and put on its refrigerator. I mean, seriously.
To me, like, so the Tesla Model S, and then
it looks like the shoe.
No,
right?
I mean, like the Tesla Model S, it does look nice. It looks more like a BMW,
right?
Versus a Prius.
Exactly, and you're right. You're right there.
Obviously, the Cybertruck, that is kind of just left field attention getter. That's kind of maybe the issue with a successful company with an owner that then has more input than maybe he should have.
Or maybe he just likes to get high and watch Back to the Future and say, we need a stainless steel truck.
Well, and what's funny is, and I thought this at the time, and now I'm kind of like, nah, is, that is very, the DeLorean Back to the Future style.
Totally
that is the 70s, cyberpunk.
Yeah.
So obviously Cybertruck.
Right.
So, and that was always what people thought of maybe in the future.
Yes.
So then it was kind of like, okay, is this just a self-fulfilling prophecy that
I hope so.
This design was looked at in the 80s as it's what we're going to have now.
Right.
But that didn't happen, but then it happened because of the 80s.
Right. Yeah.
What's interesting too, it popped on the other day of the old show Quantum Leap.
Yeah.
And the opening scene has not Sam, but the hologram guy, Al.
Al. Yes.
And he's in a self-driving electric car.
Right.
That sounds and looks like what they're trying to do with all the Teslas and the Rivians, with all the LEDs and the lighting and all that stuff. And that was basically, around this time frame.
Right.
So that's, everyone thought we were going to be electric vehicles in the future.
Oh, we were supposed to be the Jetsons already.
The Jetsons, all that. It's kind of just in the last, like I said, 10 years, it's all being kind of like, okay, we got to be electric now.
Well, honestly, between you and I think Biff Tannen had it right. So I think he's really the guy that had it right. But anyways, Tesla could be another show because I really want to bring up some other guys. Let's bring up, you mentioned Rivian, which I believe is the first electric truck.
Well, that's the first production electric truck, widely available.
Sure.
And, obviously they took a lot of the styling cues of the Tesla, maybe the luxury, kind of, tech look of it, but they kind of also have kind of honed in on, okay, well, who's using a truck as an enthusiast,
right?
Go after your off-roader, your overland, kind of driving guy.
Well, that's where I know Sean Holman, obviously a friend of ours, and one of the hosts of the Truck Show
podcast.
And obviously has his magazine that he has out now that's focused heavily on overlanding. Sean can't stop talking about that thing. He just thinks that thing's wonderful. And that's what he's talking about, though. I'm in agreement with him. I think that what I see out of that is a pretty good package.
Well, and that's you look at the regen braking that we see for charging things back up, getting a little bit extra juice out of it. You look at those motors and that type of a braking for off-roading, for traction, for crawl control,
right?
Kind of a thing, like instant
Amazing.
Torque.
Yeah.
That is kind of a perfect scenario for that. And, obviously being all the electric controlled, you can adjust, the ride height, you can adjust the suspension.
Yeah.
They've obviously, like you look at a, Tesla or, that has like ludicrous mode or sports mode or economy mode. Okay. Well, the Rivian's got a, off-road mode, a crawl mode, a snow, basically any terrain you can think of, it really dials in on it. And, and they've done some things, some design stuff as well that kind of cater to the camping with, gear,
stowage and stuff like that. Yeah.
And, accessories that you can buy.
Yeah.
And even too, what's really cool with the SUV, the R1S, full glass roof.
Right.
And, fold down, obviously, seating, and being that it is electric, you can kind of have the AC or the heat running.
Right.
and
During-
have no issues.
yeah.
You're not having to keep the car on and
Right.
the, gas going out and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like, all right, hey, let's go camp in the Rivian
Yeah.
under the stars.
Right.
And
No, they're
nice
pretty
and
cool.
comfortable.
I know they're manufactured here in California right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the manufacturer in California, and they've had some issues, similar to Tesla of manufacturing either quality or fit and finish. And,
Yeah.
and I think a lot
It's
of
a
that
new
is
car company.
It's new car companies.
Yeah.
You still got a lot of the people are obviously from, the automotive industry, but
Right.
you still got to get everything kind of figured out, dialed in. And it's also it's ramping up production. Tesla, I believe, last year sold almost 1 million
Right.
cars.
And like, you and I just were at the Peterson Museum looking at the Tesla installation there.
Yeah.
And, I mentioned and pointed out a lot of things to me, fit and finish wise. I was not very impressed with Tesla. And I've been in Teslas and I'm not super impressed by a lot of their fit and finish. But however, their latest sports car that they just had on display there, I mean, I'm blown away. And I think that Tesla is finally just kind of coming into their own stride and they're getting the fit and finish down along with the performance, so hats off to them.
Yeah. No, and that's, there's any new company is going to have their growing, pains and their spurs and trying to get kind of things going. And, what's funny is, I think Tesla and some of the newer companies are overly critiqued.
Yes.
Compared to your traditional company. It's like I hear on like NPR on the radio and stuff, and there's a Tesla recall on this part of it. It's like, yeah, but you're not announcing that Chevy had a recall or Kia had a recall on.
They do all the time.
Every week.
They even call them campaigns.
Yeah, that's called spin.
So funny. Yeah, it's a spin right there for you. Yeah.
But no, and so that's the thing, and especially with talking about every time there's a crash.
Yeah.
That's how many people crash their cars every day?
Right.
Thousands.
Yeah.
But if it's a Tesla crash, it gets news.
Exactly.
Right. And that's just kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah.
But yeah, so right when Tesla was just kind of starting to move and not really, selling, vehicles, Nissan came out with the Leaf, which
Forgot
was
about
the
that
very
little car.
first mass marketed
Yes.
EV vehicle.
That's a global car.
And that was global. Yeah.
Yeah.
First mass market EV, first zero emissions,
Yes.
mass marketed vehicle. And surprisingly, they sold a lot of those.
Didn't they? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But it, that then kind of transferred. Okay. You've got, plug-in Priuses. You've got, obviously the Tesla that kind of kept, growing and growing. I think it's probably only been the last 3 years that like everyone's just been EV kind of crazy and pushing for EVs and
Right.
it being the hot kind of ticket.
Well, maybe.
So I think, we've kind of gotten up to more or less current day standards with the history of the EV. Obviously there's even more alternative fuels from, hydrogen, all that stuff, but obviously we're sticking with one. But I think for the next, part 2 of this, I think we'll run with, kind of the explosion of popularity and the green rush of every manufacturer.
Yes.
To, basically think that they have to turn their entire production assembly lines to only EVs. And also too, for the custom side of it, it's not just LS swap anymore.
That's
like
right.
you can do an EV swap.
That's right.
So I think we'll get into that in the next one.
Yeah, sounds good.